Even the hatred of squalor makes the brow grow stern. Even anger against injustice makes the voice grow harsh. Alas, we who wish to lay the foundations of kindness could not ourselves be kind. Welcome back to the 10,000 Heroes Show. I'm your host, Ankur Shah Delight. I opened with a few words of Bertolt Brecht, and we'll get to that later, because earlier this week, I spoke with world-renowned mediator Ken Cloke. Ken is a frequent guest on this show and an important mentor of mine. As far as I'm concerned, Ken is a living, breathing apostle of the philosophy of practical nonviolence that Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. took to such a high level. Because that call was with a group of professional mediators, I asked Ken what the recent U.S. election might mean for mediators in the U.S. I'm sharing his answer with you because I see the philosophy behind mediation as being appropriate to anyone involved in human relationships. The mediation mindset is what happens when you look at human relationship as a spiritual path. So I don't think this is just for mediators. I think this is important wisdom and a mindset to adopt for all of us. And I encourage you to listen to Ken with the following question in mind. What is the essence of nonviolence? Because he doesn't say that word very often. He's talking about what happened with the election, authoritarianism, how win-lose systems create hatred, and what it means to have enemies and internalize the sense of what is an enemy. So he only says the word nonviolence explicitly only once, near the end of the episode. But everything he's saying about doubling down on our values and rising above hatred is, in my mind, the core, the absolute core of Gandhian teachings. So there's also some specifics about the election and what Trump may or may not do as president. That's not where I want us to focus. In fact, I took out a bunch of it. But I left in the parts that have to do with authoritarianism because it fits into a larger narrative of human decision-making, going from power to rights to interests. I'll say more about that in later episodes, but the basic gist of the idea is that democracy is a rights-based framework, which I consider to be more evolved, more just, and more stable than a power-based framework like dictatorship. Ken's work in applying mediation to politics advocates for something even more advanced, an interest-based framework that is not a zero-sum game like an election. I've been referring to the limits of democracy in the past couple of episodes, precisely because democracy has winners and losers baked in. So the cheat sheet version is power bad, rights medium, interest good. And I'd like to say power past, rights present, interest future. But of course, we are living in an undeniable worldwide trend of people supporting power-based frameworks, which is absolutely important to understand instead of react or judge. Other important tidbits are Ken's definition of an enemy, which is a real kick in the stomach, and his architecture of hatred, the three essential elements to creating political hatred. That was my favorite part. I mean, it's not my favorite thing, but you know what I mean. And without further ado, I now present to you 16 minutes of Ken Cloke's personal genius.
When the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, Albert Einstein was interviewed by the press, and what he said is, in quotes, "Everything has changed except the way we think." And I think that's what just happened. I think everything has changed except the way we think. A lot of the assumptions that we have lived with for decades are now at least in play, if not actually being actively dismantled and shifted in a fundamentally different direction. So the question becomes, how do we as mediators respond to this fundamental shift? The first difficulty is we have no idea at this point how far this is going to go, what it's going to entail. But if we simply take what we know and we imagine 10 million people being deported from the United States, if we imagine dropping out of the Paris Agreement on climate change, we imagine ending support for Ukraine. This is sending a signal not only in the United States, but I think worldwide, that we are in a fundamentally different conflict resolution environment now. What characterizes, in my mind, dictatorships, autocracies, fascist forms of government is that they are efforts to resolve conflicts by eliminating the opposition. What we have is a resort to power, a retreat even from rights, And these are going to create tremendous difficulties for us as mediators. It's hard for us even to imagine what those will be like when you are locked in a deeply adversarial conflict. Nobody wants a peacemaker. And so it becomes much more difficult to do the work that we are doing. Part of what is being fought over is legitimacy of kindness, of caring, of inclusion, of collaboration, of recognition of the interests of others. And that's a part of what conflict resolution really stands for. So I think we're going to be in for some hard times. How do we face those difficulties? What do we do? How does our thinking need to change in order to be able to figure out how we respond to these things? We need to return and double down on the values that inform the conflict resolution process, the core values that are really at the center of everything that we do. The realization that all of this anger and hatred and prejudicial thinking is, in the first place, counterproductive, and in the second place, unnecessary, and in the third place, incredibly destructive. So part of what happens when you respond to hatred with hatred is that hatred wins. Even if you hate the hater, if you hate the hatred, no matter what it is that you are using your hatred for, hatred ends up becoming the dominant form of relationship. So I think we need to be clear about what it is that we stand for and what's core for our purpose. Now, this is not going to be easy. There's a wonderful poet whose name is May Sarton, and she said, "One must think like a hero to behave like a merely decent human being. One must think like a hero to behave like a merely decent human being." And I think that the heroism is what it is that we are trying to do. It's a heroic act, and it becomes increasingly heroic to be able to sort of stand between combatants who don't want to listen to anything that might suggest that they have to step down from this conflict. I think it's likely that our work is going to become more difficult. It's going to become harder and harder to do this because this is not just a local United States phenomenon. This is a global phenomenon. And what has happened in the US now is likely to trigger similar events in other places around the world and make it more difficult for us to do the work. At the same time, we know intuitively and practically what we represent as the way forward. This is actually the way forward for the human race as a whole, which is to not treat each other as enemies, to stop murdering each other in the name of some sort of idea of being victorious. We can think of the Inquisition. We can think of all of the incredibly brutal wars that human beings have fought against one another over millennia. And we can see that sooner or later, people discover, first of all, they get exhausted. Secondly, they get injured themselves, traumatized themselves. Third, they discover that this is not successful in solving problems. And so a group of people arises who say, forget all this. This is useless and counterproductive. We need to focus on problem solving. And I think that's the group that we need to orient ourselves to, and the idea that we need to orient ourselves to. So the question then becomes, how do we do that? How do we provide spaces for people to tell the truth and tell our own truth from the perspective not necessarily of politics and political issues, but from the perspective of values and the values that inform the mediation process, the values that undermine all of our relationships with one another that are positive and that we want to encourage. And how do we do that without demonizing the other side, without hating the ones who hate? So there are a couple of things that we can say about this. There is Bertolt Brecht, famous playwright, very active poet and opponent of fascism. He wrote a wonderful play called The Resistible Rise of Arturo Ui, which is about Hitler and the rise of Hitler and the rise of someone in the US who would become a kind of Hitler substitute. But here's what he says from our point of view that's important. He says, quote, "Even the hatred of squalor makes the brow grow stern. Even anger against injustice makes the voice grow harsh. Alas, We who wish to lay the foundations of kindness could not ourselves be kind. So how do we retain our kindness while at the same time not surrendering the principles that guide us, that are essential to what it is that we do? This is not an easy problem to solve, and I don't think that there is a single clear answer to it. And I think that it's going to be a struggle to figure out how to do this, as it is with our own relatives who find themselves in opposite camps, with our friends, our neighbors, our colleagues. We cannot, in political mediations, ask people to give up what they believe in, and we cannot ask them to give up their passion, their emotions around what they believe in, because these are alternative futures. And it is completely legitimate for us to find ourselves in one or another different future and not find ourselves at all in some different future. And these futures are what are being battled over: the right to decide how your children are going to grow up. This process that we are in is vulnerable to storytelling. It's vulnerable to politeness and kindness. It's vulnerable to facts. In other words, it's vulnerable to all the stuff that we do in mediation. Now, the question remains, how did we get into this mess? And what could we possibly do to get out of it? And I think there's a simple answer to how we got into it. If you want to figure out how to create political hatreds, you only need really three things. One, an issue that is complex and has multiple correct answers. Two, people who care deeply about those answers. And three, an adversarial, zero-sum, win-lose process for deciding which of those futures is going to happen. That's all you need, just those three things. And you are guaranteed to create polarization, hatreds, and antagonism. As soon as you assume that there is a single correct answer, and that is yours, then the only question is, how far are you willing to go to make sure that that answer happens? And for many people, the answer includes murder of your opponent, the silencing of your opponent, which is a step in that direction, the humiliation of your opponent, which is another step in that direction. If we know that that's what the real source of the problem is, we also know what the solution is. And the first solution is you're not going to change complex, multifaceted political issues by overly simplifying them. That's a part of what is in the playbook of every autocrat and every dictator and every fascist government. We can't change the fact that people care about these things, nor do we want to. We want people to care deeply about the things that matter to them and to have it be okay for them to care about it. For us as mediators, that actually has to be a positive thing. Even though many mediators try to quiet people down and get them to care less about what they are asking for, I think we want the opposite. We want to legitimize caring as deeply as you possibly can about all this stuff. That's important. So what needs to change is the adversarial win-lose, zero-sum process for deciding which of these futures we're going to pursue. And that's where we come in. We can sit down with groups of people on any issue, and we can identify what all the possible solutions are. And instead of saying, which one are you going to vote for and which one are you going to vote against, we can say, let's talk. Let's have a dialogue. Let's brainstorm possible solutions that allow us to combine these things together. To me, that's the way forward. But that idea does not have a political champion at this point. If you look all around, you won't find that idea mentioned very often in any political circles, even in mediation circles. And I know because I've been pushing for it for a while. So how do we get there? I think that the answer is by building conflict resolution capacity in people on a multi-tier basis, what is called multi-track diplomacy. I think we can pretty much forget about reaching the top levels of government. I don't think that's likely to take place. There's too much attention to power and desire for power to be able to accept this. But if we work at the ground level, if we show children in elementary school and junior high and high school that it is possible to do this successfully, the next step becomes relatively easy. If we can do this in our personal relationships, why can't we scale this up and do it on a larger scale? What has to happen? We need to bring together people from both sides and figure out ways of drawing them into dialogue with one another. In the beginning, I think this is going to be rejected. In the short term, we can expect that we are not going to succeed. There are going to be a succession of failures. However, I don't think that's going to be for a long period of time because people are increasingly going to realize that there is something deranged in the way that we are going about this, something cruel, something that contradicts the things that we would like to believe about ourselves. What we are doing is absolutely valid and true. It is sacred work. And the sacredness of that work, I think, becomes clear to people in two settings. One, when they become exhausted by their fighting and they're not getting anything from it anymore, and they need to have somebody who can help them figure out how to get out of the mess that they've gotten themselves into. And the second is when the other side becomes more human to them. And it just becomes very, very difficult to sustain the image of the other that you have created. And this happens really kind of individually, person by person. And then all of a sudden it begins to expand. But the courage that it takes to do this, the heroism, as May Sarton described, I think is very real. The problem with most of the protest movements that exist right now is that they haven't understood the basic point of nonviolence. For me, it became very, very clear in the civil rights movement. I was in many situations working in the South in the civil rights movement where I was under attack. And it didn't bother me so much that I was under attack, but when I saw little children being humiliated and attacked and dogs sicked on them, that's what got me. And when it got me, I became angry. And when I became angry, I lost all the moral suasion that I might otherwise have had. I lost virtue. I lost legitimacy. I lost the higher ground of caring and connection. This is very real. And the question is, how do you treat the other side? And for me, this is expressed in something that I am writing now called What is an Enemy? We create our enemies and we create them in the image of our suffering. So if we are frightened, the enemy is scary. If we are feeling angry, the enemy must be infuriating. Whatever it is that we are feeling, the enemy is the creator of that. Here's what an enemy is. Someone whose sight, smell, sound of voice, or even name generates a feeling of anger, fear, grief, shame, guilt, jealousy, or hatred inside you. Someone to whom you no longer extend empathy or compassion. Someone for whom dignity and respect are conditional and easily withheld. Someone for whom it is possible to rationalize or justify acts of meanness or cruelty. Someone in whose presence you become inauthentic, off-balanced, stressed, or different from who you are naturally. Someone for whom you already know the answers without having to ask open-ended questions. Someone you feel unprepared to forgive or reconcile or trust. Someone with whom you are unwilling to engage in dialogue. Someone it is easy to dehumanize, stereotype, demonize, marginalize, prejudge, and discriminate against. Someone you wall off inside yourself, creating a part of you that is alienated from itself. Someone who stimulates stress or negative emotions inside you, creating a part of you that is saturated with negative emotions and energy. Someone for whom you cannot experience love, generosity, gratitude, or kindness. In other words, someone who owns you. It's someone who owns you. And that realization that they own you is one of the best arguments against hatred that there is. Why do you let them decide who you are going to be? So I think we keep on doing what we do. We double down on it. We continue helping people come to a place where they can see that the way that they treat the other person becomes a definition of themselves. They become the person who they create through their story, their narrative. And so we have these skills and we need to develop them in even greater measure. And then we need to take them into the political world where it's going to be extremely difficult to do this.